Hello, and welcome to UCU Live. We have got an amazing panel of speakers with us this evening. We are really pleased to be joined by two members of the Independent SAGE panel. We've got Professor Ann Phoenix with us and Professor Elizabeth Stokoe. We've also got Larissa Kennedy, who's the President of the NUS with us again. And we've also got our President-elect, who specifically covers FE, Janet Farrar. And as ever, we've got Pri with us, who will be doing British Sign Language. So thanks everyone for joining. We called this event last week because we knew that we'd be making an important announcement over the weekend regarding HE, but we also had ongoing concerns about guidance, particularly in England, that had not yet been published about FE. So I just want to give you a little bit of a recap about where we are, about the things that we said over the weekend, and where we think this leaves us as stakeholders of education, post-16 education more broadly. So you'll have seen during the weekend, we established a national position regarding higher education that we think that where possible, and we understand that there are some circumstances where this, for very good reasons, isn't possible, learning at higher education should remain online. We know that there's some subject-specific disciplines where people need to be in the classroom, and we support being able to help those students and staff get back to campus, not work, because we've all been working, but campus as safely as possible and mitigate against risks. But in general, we think it's going to be safest all round to try and keep the amount of people on campus and in classrooms to a minimum. Wasn't a decision that we took lightly, but we think it's much safer that way, and it allows us to revisit that on a regular basis. And if it becomes safer, to essentially pivot to the blended system that's being put forward now as what we should be doing in the future. We also, therefore, adopted a position that we shouldn't be encouraging as many students as you would normally see on campus and in halls of residence to come back either. Again, much like online and in classroom teaching, we acknowledge and understand that there will be students for whom campus is home and they should be able to come back, or for various other reasons, they don't have a family home, or maybe home isn't always safe for them, or for other reasons to do with access to learning, need to come back to campus, or need to come back to their halls of residence in their university town. But we want to find safe ways for those students to be able to do that. And we want to find safe ways for staff to be able to support those students to do that. So what we wanted to do in this session today was really kind of outline where we are, make that clear, demonstrate that this, isn't a decision that we just sort of came to lightly, but has been very much guided, particularly by the Independent SAGE report. It's one of the reasons I'm really glad to have two of its authors with us, but also something that we really want to make sure is done in conjunction with students as well. There was a lot of potential kind of negative attitudes, I think, sort of focused towards students this weekend, that, it's student parties that would be spreading COVID, or that, students were just sort of desperate to get back to campus for Freshers Week. And that's a narrative that we do not think is true. We think that, students have a real sense of learning, but also it's not the case. It's not, we know that students enhance the cities and towns that they go to, but that we don't want students arriving thinking that there's going to be one type of experience that isn't there, and then potentially being left isolated and alone on campus if we do end up back in a lockdown situation. So one of the things that we want to particularly get Larissa's input onto is how we can make sure that students that have a right and need to return to campus can do that supported and safe. And students who in this moment, if universities do follow St Andrews and keep learning online, can be supported to remain at home and can actually be financially supported. So I guess in two senses here, we're saying that we need a U-turn on the decision for blended learning and everyone back to campus, but we also need a financial U-turn that supports students who need equipment, who need Wi-Fi, who need somewhere to stay, but also support students who have signed accommodation contracts and need to be removed from those. And in addition, there's another financial U-turn that's needed. And, this won't be a surprise to any UCU members, but actually how we fund the provision of education in HE. This is an all hands on deck situation. The idea that this can be done at the same time where there is rounds of redundancies or insecure employment contracts is not going to wash either. To really deliver the type of teaching that we need right now, innovative online teaching, small group teaching, important face-to-face sessions, needs more investment in staff, not less. So a big range of subjects that we want to cover and discuss. And I hope that you'll be able to take something from that. And that's just on HE. Once we have kind of covered the perspective on HE, we are also going to be talking to Janet, who, as I said, is our President-elect, who covers FE, prisons and adult ed. And we're going to be looking at the guidance that did eventually come out, that eventually came to us on Saturday morning, and getting an update from FE from Janet, but also discussing that guidance, discussing what we need members to be doing at FE, and really sort of updating you about that as well. So I hope that is a kind of coherent introduction for everybody about what we're going to be doing. What I want to do first is hand over, I think, to Liz and Anne, or at least Liz in the first instance, who I think is going to screen share some slides with us. So I think for the moment, Marsha might have to take the rest of us out of this screen, possibly, so that the slides can be shared. But Liz, if you're all right to kind of update us from an independent SAGE perspective in HE, that would be great. Thanks.
Okay, can you see that? Am I showing my screen correctly? Okay, many thanks for inviting us to join the webinar this afternoon. As you know, Independent SAGE held a consultation for its draft university statement on the 21st of August. We're currently dotting the I's and crossing the T's on the final statement, which should appear online this week. We were hoping to have it ready for today's event, actually, and one of our colleagues is also presenting today at UUK, but we're happy to have this opportunity to present the key messages and updates this afternoon. So as you'll remember, Independent SAGE's aim is to keep universities open and COVID safe. And so for a zero COVID university and a COVID safe student experience, we have the following 4 recommendations. They are pretty much the same as you read already. I just want to emphasize some points and give some updates in this presentation. So first of all, to protect the safety of students and staff and prevent community infections, we recommend that all university courses should be offered remotely and online, unless they're practice or laboratory based, with regular review points. So in other words, a planned, data-driven, stepwise pivot to in-person delivery rather than a rapid pivot away from hybrid or dual modes. Secondly, universities with the support of government funding must ensure that all students have the resources necessary to participate in online teaching and study. So for example, by conducting an audit before the start of term to determine that students have the facilities to study, so computers, internet access and so on. And then implement a strategy to ensure that all students have the necessary resources, which might include the use of on-campus IT facilities, open safely, and the provision of equipment to students, or the use of space and study hubs and local libraries and so on in the community. Thirdly, when students and staff attend campus, a COVID-safe university should be secured through the following steps. And again, these are the familiar ones from the consultation document. So an online welcome week and the delivery of all teaching in the first 2 weeks of term, alongside restrictions of social activities among students where feasible. Mitigations, the usual ones that we're all familiar with now in classrooms and other public indoor spaces. Residential bubbles and segmenting, which will be more effective if they're not constantly breached via mutually exclusive in-person class compositions. And then a collaboratively designed social agreement for COVID-safe behaviours for students and staff on campus. And we appended an exemplar strategy to the consultation document. full consultation with university staff, rigorous health and safety procedures. We know that universities have put in place many of these procedures and done excellent work in preparing to reopen campuses. Attention to equality and diversity issues, and an overarching communication strategy, which is also appended as an exemplar to the main document. And then finally, an overall mitigation plan that includes a clear public health strategy and advice on testing and support. And then finally, to emphasise point 4, which is that we recommend that we have a national coordinated steps that are taken by universities and maintained as the pandemic evolves. While universities may vary greatly in terms of the geography, student body and facilities, etc., they should work together to develop guidance, policy and practice, rather than compete in their offers to students. In terms of updates then on key and detailed recommendations, you might remember from the consultation that Universities UK emphasised that it is not recommending significant in-person teaching, but rather asking members to look at risks and balance learning always with safety in mind. Something else that we know is in the mix at the moment is the almost daily announcement on social media of in America colleges closing campuses with a rapid pivot to 100% online. We know what the data is looking like in the UK, so this slide just shows the number of daily cases rising. This is from Independent Sage's briefing last week. And then just to trail the fact that Independent Sage is putting together an emergency statement on schools currently on Scotland, based on the fact that Scotland and Northern Ireland have opened, and what the impact this is showing already. So although we know that schools at the moment are probably reflecting levels of community transmission, we also see immediately that many people are having to isolate, so students from school, as this unfolds. So we need to keep that in mind as well. So to enable essential in-person on-campus activity and allow this to restart or continue, we recommend a clear testing strategy for students and staff. I don't want to get too much into the testing strategy because I'm not an expert in this area at all, but there are two main purposes to testing. First of all, to enable us to identify pre-symptomatic or symptomless cases, which we know that the student age group often tends to be, so that they can be identified and for self-isolation to occur, and also to gather information about likely levels of infection generally on campus, necessary for decisions on countermeasures. And all of this, of course, will, if we have this data, we will be able to enable pivots back to in-person teaching, but we can't really do it without knowing this information. So a testing strategy needs to be nationally coordinated, and we want to emphasise that again in partnership with appropriate national public health bodies rather. And this will also help universities make the case for infrastructure and testing capacity, which we know is very uneven across all communities. So finally, becoming a student, as we know, involves far more than the hours of teaching and learning, the contact hours. Many students move to another town and another university rather than attend their local HEI for multiple reasons, including access to facilities, for example. So to enable this important rite of passage, we believe that these temporary measures are essential to deliver the best education to students, while also preventing clusters of infection and transmission to local communities of COVID-19.
Thank you. That was absolutely crystal clear to me. And I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that, or if I was going to sort of maybe ask a few questions, but I wanted to give you an opportunity if there was anything.
No, I think that that's a very good statement of our position.
Excellent. I was wondering before we pass over or bring in Larissa, if I could maybe just ask a few questions. Obviously, over the weekend, I was involved in a hell of a lot of media interviews where I was asked, kind of various questions. And obviously, that was great kind of coverage to get a national conversation started. But as I'm sure you're aware, kind of media interviews, sort of 3 minutes on the breakfast news is not always the best place to have a nuanced discussion about these things. And I really tried to convey to people why even limited in-person kind of classroom teaching would be problematic or potentially, you know, kind of dangerous. And I was wondering if maybe I could just ask you to kind of, either you or Anne, to kind of discuss that a bit further, because I know from my experience when I was an academic and when I was on campus, you know, what a reopening and return to sort of campus life means. But not everybody else always does. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk through even why limited in-person teaching in the classroom and the reopening of campuses kind of, you know, if you were to try and explain to someone who's not ever worked on a campus or in a university town, you know, what that means for the transport, what that means for maybe non-UCU members, but, you know, Unite and Unison members who do other key functions on university campuses, what that means for essentially bringing people back in and opening up campus. So not a little question, but I was just wondering if you could kind of give it that more sort of contextual kind of, this is why actually even blended and part-time is not part-time, if that makes sense.
Sure. So if I go first, and then maybe Anne can pick up anything that I might miss that she thinks I should have said. I think quite simply, the fewer bodies on campus that we all need to avoid at 2 meters and with masks is obviously safer. So if we start by thinking about remote delivery of teaching, then that means that there are fewer bodies around for other people who keep the campus lights on to have to keep safely distanced from. It's just as simple as that in a way. That also means that, you know, there are reduced numbers on public transport locally going into and out of the surrounding area. It also means that just very practical things about getting into and out of buildings for teaching. So you might be able to set up mitigations in classroom spaces, but then you need to somehow manage students going into and out of them, which we know is also an issue for schools. So there's a lot of logistical stuff to manage that we might be able to reduce and keep safe if we stick to remote delivery for a while longer and see how things unfold over the coming weeks with schools coming back, for instance.
And I would like to add to that it is feasible to arrange for bubbles for the few students who need to come onto campus because they have practical classes that they have to attend. But it's impossible to do that if they're going to classes, because their choices of modules and so on will cut across different bubbles that they might be in. So it makes it much more complicated if there's face-to-face teaching as well.
That's a really good point, and I'm glad you raised that, because the other kind of follow-up question that I had, and again, I think if people have not worked in a university, they're perhaps not really aware of just how many fixed-term contracts, fractional contracts, precarious types of contracts, you know, whether you're an academic member of staff, a professional service member of staff, that really exist. So we're obviously talking right at this moment about bubbles for students. But I was answering a lot of questions this weekend about actual staff, you know, so I'm present in Leicester in the East Midlands, but I know very well that often you'll have somebody who works at Leicester, Derby, maybe Coventry, but lives in Birmingham, and will teach multiple modules across those different institutions. Obviously, we'll be commuting back and forth from those different cities. And, you know, what will happen if one of those members of staff has symptoms or gets coronavirus, and what that would mean then for the various student groups that they see across, you know, 3 institutions, or what I'm wondering what universities would be required to do in that instance.
I mean, I think you set out just an example of all the reasons, all more reasons to keep it remote for the time being, because it stops those staff having to travel to lots of different places with lots of different modalities to get there, putting themselves at greater risk, and all the people they come into contact with. So yeah, you're just presenting more reasons for the report that we're writing, I think.
I think that's really important to stress the fact that while students might be living on campus or near campuses, that many members of staff cannot live near their universities. And therefore that puts pressure on them to use public transport. And often not one thing, but very many different modes of transport in order to get in. And that is difficult, I think, and raises the risks for everybody. But actually, the more people there are on campus and attending face-to-face lectures, the more cleaning there has to be. And it also means that there are more people who have to be there to service all the things that are part of the infrastructure of universities. And I think that that's really problematic. It's problematic for them, many of whom feel on the front line frightened, but also it's difficult for staff of all kinds, academic and support staff, to get in. So if it can be avoided, if it can be minimized, it's much better for everybody.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point that you said at the end there, that, obviously we're thinking about going into a classroom. I know that in a lot of institutions, the lecture hour, which as we know is sort of 50 minutes, but is going to be reduced to 40 minutes, and people required to kind of clean their space prior to or after that lecture starting. So as you say, not just the cleaning kind of associated with teaching, but actually, the staff that would be required to go into academic buildings, student residential buildings, all of the travel that they would then have to take, as you say, the risks to those cohorts as well, like what kind of individuals are those workers, what kind of vulnerabilities might they have, and we're really concerned about the entire campus community in that sense. I wondered, just before bringing Larissa in, because I think the final thing I sort of wanted to bring up, I think is very much connected to the conversations that we've been having about the role of revenue streams and the role of the need for funding. And to a certain extent, one of the things that we've been lobbying government on, obviously for years, but particularly since March and in lockdown, is the need in this moment more than ever to remove the competitive nature that exists in HE. That really undermines collaborative working at the best of times, but potentially is undermining it further right now. That you might not share something about how you're caring for students or tracking and tracing in your institution with your kind of neighbour down the road, but also how, the kind of the marketized environment and the need, to increase revenue, and sometimes that students themselves are a revenue stream. That's actually been quite detrimental in this moment to perhaps following the science and doing the right thing for public health. I know that's a bit of a political kind of question in terms of the funding, but I just was wondering really if you had any kind of points of views on how maybe we've been encouraged to adopt a bit of a dysfunctional approach to this, or not the best approach with science in mind because of those pressures.
I think all I would say is that we are advocating some national coordination of the response, perhaps particularly as you saw at the end towards testing, where we know that it can be really difficult depending on where you're living to get a test. We know how costly testing is. So I think that's one place where it would be in the public health interest to coordinate as much as possible.
Yeah, thanks.
And I just want to add something about the marketized environment, because clearly it's very expensive for each individual student to pay to come to university. But I think that sometimes students, don't appreciate that they're not just paying for face-to-face, that the education that's being provided is much broader than just the face-to-face lectures or seminars, and so that they're actually paying for that as well. That's one thing. And then I did want Liz to say something about the quality of online teaching, because that's something in Independent Sage that we feel very strongly about, and that cuts across some of the things that sometimes people feel about online teaching as necessarily second best.
Yeah, I can certainly speak to that. It's just a sort of almost default assumption that if you are in person face-to-face, then you're guaranteed a better quality experience than being online face-to-face like we all are now. And I think we just need to challenge that, because there's lots of research out there to suggest that you can be both creative, innovative and effective online. It can be quite democratizing to interact online, enabling via different channels for people to participate through multiple modalities, the chat and so on. So I think we need to think about the cohort largely of students that we are educating and collaborating with here, thinking about early career researchers who themselves are sort of publishing actually on innovations in online teaching, and just be as positive as possible about how much you can actually do this way, which is both safe and has lots of different advantages that you might not have thought of before.
I think that's such a good point, and I'm really glad that you said it, because I've had so many conversations this weekend really stating what you've just said, and you know, correcting people that actually you know, a fully thought through online delivery at this moment, and you know, the development of methods to actually engage people, in my mind, as someone who, you know, I used to deliver a lot of online learning and distance learning to adult students, will be far better than I think what is actually being proposed in some of the, you know, partial in-person learning that we're going to see potentially implemented. And I think that there is a conversation to actually be had here, because I think, and I do think that this, from my perspective, links back to the marketisation of HE, is, you know, this, at the very beginning of lockdown and throughout the past few months we've seen, is actually universities really wanting to say to students, no, we'll be open, come, there will be face-to-face teaching. And they have been doing that because they've been worried that their nearest competitor will say that if they're not saying that, and therefore that they've had to make these types of promises. But I think what we're saying now, and as I say, it's been very much guided by not just your report, but we've been saying this for numerous months, and I've been saying it to the university minister, is if we don't move to this now, we're going to end up in a position where we're forced to move to it, because we will actually have to do it. And I think your report sort of sets out those warnings very well. I think looking across to America sets that out very well. You know, so we're saying, let's do this now. Let's actually take a breath. Let's allow everybody, students and staff, to get things in place. And also, and this is why I'm going to bring Larissa in now, is let's actually center students in this conversation as well. You know, students that not just have a right to actually say what type of learning they think is best in this moment, but actually how we're going to finance students that need study spaces, technology, other types of equipment, Wi-Fi, and enable them to move, you know, if they need to move. So I don't know if you've got anything you want to add before I kind of give Larissa the stage. Obviously, we'll be hopefully hearing from you again in the Q&A, but are we good? Okay, Larissa?
Thanks, Jo. Yeah, no, really echoing what's been said, because at NUS, we do want to be clear about what the issue is. And the issue is obviously that students have been sold a lie for months, you know, the lie that going back to normal is possible, viable, safe. And fundamentally, as has been said, uni management have sold us this lie, because in the system as we know it, marketization means that, you know, profit and one-upping the competition has been put ahead of student, staff and community safety. But so, of course, this is the issue. But now we look towards what the solution is and what needs to happen, because we know that for some students, they won't move, they can't move, and they will be living at home. But for other students, home isn't accessible, it isn't safe, and it just isn't viable nor conducive to learning, and they do need to move. And I just want to dwell for a second on the kind of particular groups of students who may need to access campuses and should be able to, if they wish to. So this is of course not an exhaustive list, but I think particularly working class students, students for whom home doesn't have all of the facilities, including, you know, technology and broadband and those things that Jo mentioned, but anything else that's meaning that it's just not an environment conducive to learning, particularly liberation students as well, you know, disabled students who require particular equipment, support, other reasonable adjustments to support their learning, to access their learning, LGBT plus students who find themselves in environments that are homophobic or transphobic and need to leave those. We also know that students of colour are disproportionately in crowded households and disproportionately hold caring responsibilities in the home that might prevent them from fulfilling their learning in the ways that they want to. And so I think if we're serious about ensuring that this time and this kind of unprecedented nature of coronavirus does not kind of widen the gaps in educational injustice, then those are some of the groups of students that I think we really need to be focusing on, how we make sure that there's the right provision and the right access for those who do need to be on campus. And to do that, I think, again, echoing some of the things that have been said, but we do believe that government and university management need to urgently respond to the ask of remote provision for all learning. And of course, this means investment in making sure that it's really accessible for all students. And so for those who do and are able to stay at home, making sure that they have the resources they need, including assistive technology for disabled students, among other things. And we also need kind of that, as I was saying, that safe access to support provision, accommodation for those who need it on campus. And we have to invest in mass testing if we're going to be able to have folks who need to coming to campus. We also need a strategy for how we build new households and by extension, how we build community safely. And, you know, once we've dealt with these issues in the here and now, we also need to recognize that the very fact we find ourselves in this situation makes our collective calls for fully funded and democratized education more important than ever before. So I'm not gonna speak for too long, because I feel like a lot of it was covered, and I feel like a lot of us are on the same page and saying a lot of the same things. But just to close, I kind of want to stress that amongst students, staff and communities, we really need to approach this situation with empathy and collective care, because we know that these are crucial things that get sidelined in HE once the bottom line begins to matter more, which is, you know, a lot of the time. And like amongst ourselves, if we can hold space for students at the margins, for those for whom particularly campus is and needs to be home, then I think we'll navigate our way through this situation and ensure that everyone is safe and cared for. So yeah, I think that those are the kind of key points that I wanted to raise, but let me know if there's anything else you'd like me to speak to.
No, I think that was an absolutely perfect set of things. And I think the point you make about, you know, holding space is exactly, I think, and you know, I think it sort of speaks volumes that it's community leaders of education and, you know, scientists from the higher education sector. What we need to do now. You know, some of the comments that I've had over the weekend, it's all right, I've got broad shoulders, but is, why are you doing this now? This is chaotic. You know, you are ruining people's lives. And what we're trying to say is, there are things that can be done now that will change what might happen in 3 or 4 weeks' time. There are things that we can do now that will actually stop potential national chaos. It is far less chaotic to figure out who, you know, you've just given, as you say, a non-exhaustive list, and it's sort of the types of groups of students I would agree, you know, need space. There is time now to figure out who those people are, to reach out to them, to get them where they need to be, and not create the chaos of everybody else moving around with all of the sort of risks associated with it that I think, you know, independent SAGE have really laid out. And that's essentially what we're calling for. I think, you know, not doing that now, we can look to Scotland and see, you know, St Andrews, I think, have taken the step to say we're online now until I think it was week 7. But obviously a lot of students have just moved, and some of them will be very disappointed with the fact that they've just moved and you know, not going to get what they thought they were going to get. So I think being honest and open and having these conversations now, but as you say, being really clear about whose responsibility it is to sort of address this and solve this is also really important. I had one question or one point that I just wanted to raise, because I, of all the things I was asked, this wasn't it, but I think it was Liz, you said that, you know, without proper testing, actually, and, you know, the sort of the two-pronged point about that was that we know, therefore, who may have it, but also the idea that we can't really reopen until we have control of that. I don't think that's really been picked up in the testing, that actually how we arrive at a safe campus we'll only know through testing as well. And I just thought that was a really important point that I think has been massively missed. I'm going to bring Janet in because I want to make sure that we talk about FE before we move to any questions that people might have been submitting on social media. So Janet, do you want to kind of give us an update? Because obviously FE, this weekend it was all HE, but as you know, and Larissa knows, the previous 2 weeks have been completely FE dominated, and there's a lot to say about that. So I was wondering if you could give us an update, and then we could talk a little bit about the situation in general.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jo, and thanks for putting me on after those excellent speakers. So now I've got to follow that. I agree. I can relate to a lot of what has been said, and I think a lot of our FE colleagues will be able to as well. The government tends to kind of bundle FE in with schools, and there were various points during lockdown where FE colleges weren't even mentioned, and we just had to read colleges from the school's guidance. And actually, we're a lot closer to universities in FE and in adult education than we are to schools. You know, apart from some provisions for pre-16 children, which do exist in FE colleges, the large proportion is over 16 and adults. And obviously that is creating problems in terms of, you know, you can't really have a bubble because it tends to be mixed campuses of adults and 16 to 18-year-olds, and it's not working in the same way as it does with schools. And without wanting to moan too much, you know, the school's guidance came out on Friday night, and then tell me FE wasn't an afterthought when the government guidance for FE came out on Saturday morning. It's pretty clear that they thought, oh yeah, there's a few 100,000 students in FE colleges that we might want to have a think about. So you know, I think it's really important to acknowledge that like university staff, FE staff have been working throughout the lockdown period, and a lot of FE staff have been working on site during the lockdown period, supporting vulnerable students and students with educational healthcare plans, etc. And also, of course, more recently fielding queries and complaints about the exams fiasco, which obviously is a conversation for another time. You know, and support staff and lecturers have been supporting students throughout these periods. Most FE staff have been back since mid-August, trying to navigate face-to-face enrolment in some cases, a mixture of face-to-face and online enrolment. But quite some are still working from home and a bit of a balanced approach. Some colleges have been working really well with the recognised trade unions in terms of making sure there are suitable and sufficient risk assessments in place. One of the barriers that we're facing, however, is that sometimes risk assessments were agreed and kind of signed off, and then obviously we had the summer period and people went on annual leave, etc., and then coming back to a completely different risk assessment that hasn't been agreed. So there are still a lot of concerns in FE circles. There's the added kind of level of local lockdowns as well that are still happening, and you know, there's a concern that isn't being built into the risk assessments in the right way. And also, of course, vulnerable groups that Larissa was talking about, you know, over 55s, Black members, you know, people with underlying health conditions, vulnerable and extremely vulnerable staff. Now, you know, the government has not separated them out anymore, you know, they must be terrified. You know, I think they would be very anxious, and a lot of people don't come under those categories and are feeling very anxious about on-site return. Just trying to think about what hasn't been covered. I mean, we've not talked loads about it, but you know, it's important to acknowledge that working from home is not ideal. Learning from home is not ideal. The mental health impact, you know, some people, like Larissa was saying, are living in unsafe environments for loads of different reasons. We're not saying this is ideal. What we're saying is we need to look at the safest approach that we've got right now, and that was the announcement around universities. So there is an acknowledgement that the FE colleges are already back on site, but you know, there's still work to be done to make sure that they're kept as safe as possible, and that our members are kept as safe as possible, because the 5 tests that we laid out on the back of the NEU's original campaign for schools haven't actually been kind of achieved yet. So everything is being done on a local level. So there's still lots of work for us to do, and we don't have all the answers, but we do need to support each other and make sure that we are doing our best to push back against problematic employment practices in this instance. Stop there for now, I think.
completely agree with everything you've just said. And I think, you know, what we've seen in the last few weeks, but particularly last week, obviously, is a huge kind of, in my opinion, kind of ideological push to get people back in workplaces, in offices. Obviously, education has been a huge kind of target of that. This is despite, you know, a YouGov poll that says adults of working age don't think you should be going back into the workplace, you know, before it's necessary or if it's safe to do so. I think what we're all saying in here, as people invested in, you know, stakeholders of education or educational professionals ourselves, we don't think actually that the risks that some people say are associated with online learning are going to be so detrimental that actually we should rush everybody back in. I think you're completely right. A lot of people, the government included, just bundle colleges in with schools. They don't take into account that they're adult spaces. You know, there was a comment that popped up whilst you were talking, which, you know, is exactly the same as HE. Some FE colleges are spread over several different sites. Teaching and learning support are ongoing to move between them. Learning support staff will also be expected to move from one vocational area to another, depending on days learners are there. You know, it's, as you say, it's the exact same sorts of problems. And just to pick up on what you were saying, so we were expecting in England, we'd already had it in Wales and Northern Ireland, advice and guidance for colleges. It didn't arrive on Friday night, not that Friday night would have been sufficient, you know, before a bank holiday weekend, as you say, people are already back. But it did eventually arrive on Saturday morning. What we saw in that is that the government wants all students back. Social distancing, but it's not as clear that it should be, you know, I think as stringent as you would expect. You know, we need 2 meters as a standard, not just 1 meter with mitigations as what's in the guidance. There's some scope in it to increase remote delivery with certain conditions, but it's weaker actually than previous guidance. It does have that colleges should be ready to shift to remote provision by the end of September if there are local lockdowns. You know, it kind of includes that, but it's very weak on face coverings. They're not really obligatory to use anywhere from what I can see. There is additional funding for local transport providers for extra transport to schools and colleges and staggered start times to encourage not offset everybody being on public transport at the same time. But I think, again, the parallels with HE are the same in terms of there's lots of people that have to get into a college to make it ready to be open full scale for everyone to be in. As you say, everyone's been working in between. But really, and this comes back to some of the things we were saying about testing. Colleges are only getting 10 home testing kits each. And these home testing kits are to be used in exceptional circumstances. I'm not quite sure what counts as an exceptional circumstance when you've only got 10 tests. I don't know how many members of staff, Janet, work in your college. Well,
I mean, it varies, but, you know, you might have 10,000 students and, you know, 1,000 staff easily. Yeah, so 10 tests to be used sparingly and only in exceptional circumstances. Again, PPE should be turning up this week for colleges, just in the nick of time. And there isn't really enough in there for vulnerable staff. I think it's really complacent, the guidance about rates of transmission, and it basically treats vulnerable staff the same as if they were everybody else. And again, I think that's a piece of the advice that when I've compared it to the previous iterations has actually been weakened. So what we were obviously doing over the summer for FE was we weren't going to wait around for this guidance to materialise. So we have been across the UK negotiating risk assessments with individual colleges and employers. On the whole, as you say, some of that's sort of been subject to change in September, but on the whole, we have found that most colleges have been cooperating with us. I was wondering if you could say a little bit, because we've had a few questions that have come in about what members should do on the ground in instances where, you know, management are kind of pushing safety beyond what you think numbers in rooms, according to what a health and safety officer says. I'm assuming you've had similar sorts of concerns coming from members. So what would essentially be your advice on the ground to members in colleges where
management aren't being as cooperative or are pushing the boundaries, or standards, in a few weeks look like they're starting to slip? What would your advice to members be?
Yeah, I mean, there's no massively easy answer to that, and it's a shame to hear that these unsafe practices are going on. And there's loads of advice on the UCU website, so please do have a look at the COVID section of the UCU website. We are a trade union, so we always focus on things from a collective approach. If individual members are watching this and are concerned, the first place you should be going to is to your branch officers, because there might be things in the pipeline that they've negotiated with the employer through their mechanisms, whether it be a joint negotiating committee or whatever, and get involved. We need more health and safety reps, we need more reps, so put yourself forward, and it can be a really rewarding thing to do. So we hope that employers will continue to work effectively with the recognised trade unions in the workplace. In terms of individual members, what we would really want is for them to be contacting their line managers themselves, and saying, I feel anxious about coming on site, or I have a dependent at home who is at high risk, and I don't feel comfortable coming on site. And really to be asking for individual risk assessments, which anyone can request, to think about how their situation could be managed in terms of doing their day job, essentially. So everybody's got a role to play in this. You don't sit at home and worry about it, or sit on the bus on the way to work worrying about it. You need to be telling your line managers so that we can make sure that these things change.
Great, thank you. We've had a few questions that have come in, particularly about health and safety and face-to-face teaching and face masks and those sorts of things. So I just wanted to kind of update people with and obviously particularly in FE, this will be different depending on what part of the UK you're in, whether you're in Wales, whether you're in Northern Ireland or England. Like there are different guidelines that different jurisdictions have at the moment negotiated with the government in your locality. One of the things that we've been doing nationally is drawing together, since the pandemic started, health and safety advice on your rights at work. Some links are going to get posted in the forum that you're watching this via social media to take you to those bits on the UCU website about Section 44, which in particular is the health and safety legislation about your rights at work with regards to health and safety, and if you feel that is under threat. So what we would say is, like, really consult that if you are worried on an individual basis. But as Janet's also said, the reason you join this union is not so that you have to always deal with this on an individual basis. So if any of the concerns that we've raised in this session apply to you, you need to go to your branch immediately. You need to consult the links that we're giving you and take this forward collectively would be what I would say. We know that people are really anxious about returning, particularly if there's an outbreak. There's a question here that we've just had is what would happen in HE if there was an outbreak? What would happen, in a city if there was an outbreak in HE? Do students get locked down in halls of residence? I think this is a really good question. I don't know if either Liz or Anne have been involved in any conversations, either with institutions or in the writing of the report, about what has been said would happen. I know that this is a real concern with us, and I've chatted briefly with Larissa about it, about what would happen to students, what would be the pastoral care for them, what would be the kind of counselling available, how would even basic things like food be delivered, what would the cleaning of those services be like? So I don't want to put you on the spot, but if any of you have actually been involved in those conversations and know what the answers are, I would be interested to hear them.
We do list some sorts of responses and contingencies in the consultation document with regards to monitoring students who are quarantining and providing support to self-isolating students, delivering meals, all those kinds of things. So there is some of that detail in the document. But obviously, what counts as a breakout is difficult to define, and immediately becomes more difficult to deal with if you've got students who are living in halls but participating in in-person teaching in lots of different groups, because then there is the issue around finding and testing and tracing and isolating and supporting. So all of those things are complex if that happens on campus. It's a really difficult question to approach, I think.
Larissa, have you got any kind of thoughts initially about what you would want to see in any situation where that occurred?
Yeah, so I think there's a fundamental issue around the idea of locking down halls. For us is around, like, what is the mental health provision? Like, what does that look like? Is there going to be further investment in making sure that that's widespread? Because at the moment we're just not seeing clarity on what that would look like. Then there's all the practicalities that Liz and others have raised around, like, what would that mean for food? What would that mean for, particularly students with dietary requirements? Would it be halal? Would it be kosher? Would it be, like, there's just so many considerations that just haven't seemingly been thought through, and we haven't been convinced by any conversations that we've had that they have been fully thought through. And so we are really urging that we need to have clear guidance on how we safely build those new households, but also on how we then safely build new communities, because the issue that we're raising around, if people are doing in-person teaching, the kind of cross-contamination, how you test and trace that also applies if students are convening elsewhere. So we really do need a clear strategic direction on that as well.
Janet, there was a question about if there's some form of lockdown in FE. So obviously we can see in the guidance that colleges are being asked to make provision for what that might look like. I'm just wondering if, on a more like localized, on the ground level, if that's something that's really happening in colleges, and what that looks like.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think FE staff have spent a lot of time over the summer and before it kind of moving provision online. So in theory, there would be things in place if we had to go back into lockdown. From a kind of branch point of view, each employer should have agreed as part of the risk assessment procedure something called a serious and imminent danger procedure, which really tells you what to do if you feel in danger. And if there's an outbreak in a college or in a university or in any educational establishment, then there should be provisions within that SID procedure that would detail what would happen. And we don't want to be in a situation where there's an outbreak to then have to make that decision. These are things that have to be in place, otherwise people aren't safe. So and that's the law.
Yeah, of course. So I'm just trying to see if there's been any more particular questions. Oh, sorry, Anne.
I just wanted to emphasize that one of the reasons that Independence Age is so keen that there is online teaching and that continues is that if there are, for example, outbreaks in local areas because lots of students have come in person onto campuses and so on, that one of the inequalities that can be present is that whether or not it's justified, local people attribute local outbreaks to groups of students, particularly overseas students, and there have already been attacks on students around many different countries, actually, coming from particular countries like China and so on. And it would be much better to avoid that situation happening by clear planning now.
I think that is such an important point, and I know that Larissa and I spoke over the weekend about exactly that, and I was really trying to stress, I think, in a lot of the media work that I did, that what we are trying to do now is prevent, the scapegoating of certain communities to be to blame for this. There is no good telling anybody after the fact, that, and I think we're seeing this a lot in America, students being fined or suspended, really being presented as the problem when, this is entirely preventable. And in that sense, a kind of a predictable problem that could happen. And I really want to just endorse what you just said in terms of ensuring actually that we come up with a a solution now. And another issue that came up a lot over the weekend was the extent to which, if you do this now, you will deny those economies of those communities the money that's attributed to students. Like, what will happen to those economies? And again, I think this comes back to the really damaging view of education as a revenue stream. But also, if we end up in a situation where university cities and towns have to go into lockdown because, we see increases in coronavirus in those cities, the local economies will suffer as a result of that anyway. I say that as someone who lives in Leicester, and we had an extended period of 5 weeks. Larissa, I don't know if you wanted to say anything about this, because I feel like this is your kind of community that you probably want to stand up for and speak on behalf of.
Absolutely. I mean, on what Anne was saying, I think we were really horrified to see the way that there was a spike in hate crime, particularly towards Chinese and East Asian students at the end of the last term. And I think if we can ward against that by creating the conditions for safety and recognizing that, once again, the people who are going to be the most impacted by this are the most marginalized students, of course, in the sense of physical safety, but also in the sense physical safety, I mean, in regards to the virus, but also in terms of the knock-on impacts of that. So I'm really glad that you raised that, Anne, because looking at this through an anti-racist lens as well, like, we cannot allow for students of colour to once again become the scapegoats for an issue that should be lying directly at the door of government and of university management. And so, yeah, I just wanted to thank you for raising that, Anna, just to add that.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone had anything they wanted to add to that. The other question we've had, I was wondering if I could just get you to revisit something you spoke about earlier, Liz. Someone's raised the issue about, well, universities should do their own track and tracing. So I'm wondering if you could maybe just actually talk about, and I think this, does relate to things that I've definitely been saying, how maybe actually this needs to be nationally coordinated as opposed to something that happens on a localized basis and is the responsibility of individuals or their institution.
I can't really speak to the detailed protocols for dealing with testing. There will be more information and a strategy in the final document that we publish, hopefully later this week. I think one of the things that is in there, though, that we talk about is the issue of some universities are obviously already planning testing, but the resources for doing so, the capacity differs quite wildly, I think, across the regions and so on. So that's one of the issues where we think a national debate and discussion, and this is of course happening here now, will just make the issue something that universities can collaborate on rather than compete about. We have more tests, we're going to do this more than other places. It just becomes that issue again. We also know, at least from colleagues, that universities are running all sorts of pilot tests for the best way to actually do mass testing, which I understand is difficult to achieve. I'm not an expert in this at all. So I think those are the issues that we need to get on top of if we're able to have a data-driven approach subsequently to pivot back to more in-person activity.
Thank you. I guess I just wanted to sort of sum up, because we're running out of time, by really saying that, the sentiment that you've just put across here, that we need collaboration and not competition, is something that I think everybody in this virtual chat, and I imagine most of the people who are watching, would completely agree with. A collaborative approach to support, students creating new households, being supported where they need to, is exactly what we need to see. A collaborative approach for universities working together in this moment, exactly what we need to see. Colleges working together, finding ways to support students and staff and the communities, that colleges support in this moment, of actually identifying needs, is just so important and is missed so much, because, colleges are competing with each other, are competing for government money. Universities are obviously in the same position, but they're kind of hyper-marketized variable of the student there as a source of revenue stream, and the sort of dysfunctional decisions that go along with that. So I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who's taken part, and including Pri, for what I know is exhausting work for an hour. Thank you so much. And also what I want to say to UCU members who are watching this, whether you work in prisons and obviously the massive health and safety challenges you face all the time, but particularly at the beginning of lockdown, adult ed or FE or HE, we are on this. We've got your backs. If you're in FE, you'll be getting something shortly about the return and where we are with that. Obviously with HE, this is going to be ongoing for a while now, and we are already starting to see different approaches across the different nations in the UK. My hope is that more universities follow St Andrews and do it quicker rather than later, so that we don't have the chaos of students arriving and feeling that they've been shortchanged and feeling that they regret making the move. We need some solutions about how those students are going to be reimbursed. And as everybody in this conversation, I think, has said, that's only going to be delivered by government. You know, we've been warning as a union about this on an FE and HE level since the beginning of lockdown. The government has created more chaos at every step of the way. Some of their last minute U-turns have obviously been welcomed in terms of student and educational justice on results, but have really created additional problems for institutions on how they're going to accommodate the problems that keep getting created. So thank you very much to all of our speakers. Thank you again, Pri. Thank you everyone for watching. And thank you, Marsha, who's behind the scenes making us pop up and disappear at various different times. And keep a watch on your email and our social media, because if we need to, we'll probably do another kind of quick live event, but otherwise just keep an eye on us, and also keep pressure on your employers, whether that's FE employers who might be slipping or actually in HE branches, to really push a student and staff first agenda in this moment. So thank you everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening.